Greetings and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Just Teach. My name is Tamika and I'm one of the instructors on this platform. Just Teach is a podcast where we break down theological concepts to enhance your biblical and spiritual growth. Ezra 7:10 says, "For Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach in Israel statutes and judgments." Our effort at Just Teach is to seek, do, and teach the word and will of God. If you have not already, please subscribe to the channel and click the all notifications bell. We do upload weekly lessons, and your engagement is certainly needed and most appreciated. We also want to take the time to invite you to visit us at www.justteachministries.com, where we have many Bible study resources. On the store tab, you'll find lesson notes for all the various passages that we've studied from on this platform. And you'll also find the exact notes provided, which are the notes that we use for every presentation on this channel. There is also a direct link that will be provided in the description of the video to the lesson, and there's even a link in the top of the comment section. And we do also have a new feature where you can now scan a QR code. So any video that you watch for any lesson, if you look in the upper left corner of the video, you will see that said QR code. So you'll now have easy access to the video notes for each lesson. Now, they are available for a small donation, and we want to thank you, each and every person who has been supporting our ministry. We appreciate you. We appreciate your support, your views, your likes, and shares. You are very much appreciated. Thank you so much. Now, let's go ahead and jump right into the lesson. We are coming from the UMI annual commentary, and right now we are in week 12. And our lesson is God Will Redeem Us. And this is from one of my favorite passages. I'm coming from the book of Job, and we're in chapter 19, verse 1 through 7, and we're going to skip to verses 23 through 29. Our key verse in this week's lesson comes from verse 25. "For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth." Now, we do have 2 points in today's lesson, only 2 points, and that is Job speaks to his friend's verbal attack, and Job responds to his situation. Now, as we go through the lesson, I just want you to realize what we're going to do in this lesson. First, we're going to identify that Job had an unwavering belief in God's redemption, even as he was made to suffer. We're going to affirm that though we suffer much, God loves us and offers us redemption. And then we're going to acknowledge ways that we are loved and blessed during times of trouble. Now, also keep this question at the back of your mind. How can we remember God's hope during our times of suffering? Now, just to give you some background, I did mention we're talking about Job today. The book of Job bears the name of said person, Job, and it's written approximately 2000 to 18,000 BC, and it was written to demonstrate God's sovereignty and the meaning of true faith. Now, the author is said to be Job, but some suggest that it might be Moses, Solomon, or even Elihu. So, the story of Job takes place in the land of Uz. Now, this is probably located in the northeast area of Palestine, near desert land between Damascus and the Euphrates River. And that's east of the Euphrates River. Now, Job is a man from the land of Uz, which is considered ancient Edom. And although not an Israelite, Job actually does know, or he does, as we can see throughout the book, have a relationship with God. So he is wealthy and he's blessed with many children. But he does at some point experience he has experienced great prosperity throughout his life until he is tested by God and lost everything. So if you start at the beginning of the book of Job and read your way through, you'll see that there was first a conversation that took place between God and Satan, and which Job's name came up in conversation. So God gives Satan permission to test Job and test his faith. So amid his suffering and doubt, Job remains faithful to God. Now, Job is one of the first poetic books in the Hebrew Bible, and some suggest that it's the first book of the Bible to be written. Now, this book does give insight into the works of Satan and also is mentioned in Ezekiel 14, verse 14 and 20, as well as James 5, verse 11. And Job is actually mentioned as a historical figure. So we're going to be referring to the word redeemer. We have discussed this word before in past lessons, such as the story of Ruth, and we did want to also reiterate that in the ancient Near East, the redeemer or kinsman redeemer was a person the nearest living relative, blood relative. And this person was called upon to continue the family line in the case that there were no male descendants left through marrying the widow of the next of kin. So not only do they marry the widow of the next of kin, but this person is also called upon to redeem the inheritance of those who found themselves impoverished and also those who sold themselves into slavery. So Jesus is often spoken as the redeemer of humanity. So he's the kinsman redeemer to humanity, and he is near us in his humanity as well as he has redeemed us from our slavery to sin. So as we go further, I get excited with my hands. This lesson is really exciting to me. So Job had an experience. He had an experience with the destruction of his wealth, his children, his health, and his wife. So he lost all of that: his wealth, his children, his health, and on top of all that, his wife even turned against him, telling him to curse God, but he refused. So, of all that occurred, because God allowed Satan to tempt him, he finds himself in a back and forth tug of war with his feelings and the situation that he deals with of those on the outside looking in. So the temptation was that Satan believed he would not remain faithful to God if his blessings, if his protection had been removed by God. So Job actually accepted that everything he had experienced had come from the hand of God. And as soon as these disastrous events occur, his friends come and sit beside him. And not only do they sit beside him, they try to explain to him his own situation. Again, these are people on the outside looking in, trying to explain to the person who's actually going through it. So, in trying to explain his current calamities, they blamed and accused Job and said that he was responsible for everything that was happening to him. So, the rest of the book, chapters 3 through 37, is a back and forth between Job and his friends and Job in prayer with God, and which all of this comes to the conclusion, and the final verdict is given by God in chapters 38 through 42, and Job is given double what he had before. Now, in chapter 18, Bildad argued that the trials Job experienced were punishment set aside for those who were wicked. And I don't know why, but for some reason, people have a tendency to associate wealth, prosperity, and favor with the blessings of God. So if bad things were happening to you, like if you got sick, if you lost your wealth, if you lost your loved ones, etc., people assume that you had done something wicked and were being punished for it. So in chapter 19, Job responds to the argument from Bildad and vented his frustration at the accusations being placed on him. So he also stated his innocence in their sight and how God was responsible for the trials that he was experiencing. So that brings us to the fact that, let me go back here because I'm getting ahead of myself. Despite all that he had been through, he still expected God to change his situation and vindicate him, expressing his hope in God as his redeemer and the opportunity to be in his presence. So that brings us to our first point in today's lesson. Job speaks to his friend's verbal attack. And I'm sorry if the text is overlapping with the QR code, but you can read along if you have your Bible. Then Job answered and said, "How long will you vex my soul and break me in places with words? These 10 times have you reproached me. Ye are not ashamed that you make yourself strange to me? And be it indeed that I have erred, mine error remaineth with myself. If indeed you will magnify yourselves against me and plead against me my reproach, know that God hath overthrown me and hath compassed me with this net. Behold, I cry out of wrong, but I am not heard. I cry aloud, but there is no judgment." So Job has these three friends, and now these three friends are approaching him, and what they cannot see is that his suffering it's not a result of his sin or said sin that they are accusing him of. And he tries to tell them from this perspective of his own personal experience. Again, he's the one going through this. They aren't. They weren't there when all of this happened. They just arrived on the scene. So we need to be careful not to judge the heart of another or how God is working in their lives, because again, we don't see how God is moving. First Kings 8 and 39 tells us, "Then hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and forgive and do and give to every man according to his ways, whose heart thou knowest. For thou, even thou only, knowest the hearts of all the children of man." So it is only God who sees and knows the heart and the true intent of a person's heart. Man can't see this. They only look on the outward appearance, and this is why we should never judge. So God does not always heal, and he often allows suffering to come into our lives. And even the apostle Paul had some physical disabilities or sickness. So this suffering, it comes into our lives to strengthen us. Paul asked God 3 times to heal him, but God refused and said that his power was perfect through Paul's weakness. We see that in 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 9. Now, because Paul had a disability, people were actually more apt to give God glory for Paul's ministry and to give credit to God and not Paul himself. So Job is often credited with patience, but that is actually not the case. If you actually read in depth this text and break it down and read it through the lens of his emotion, by the words alone, you can see that he was not feeling very patient considering he asked, "How long?" The Hebrew word for how long is ad, which is like asking if it will last forever. So he's asking, how long is this going to last? So that doesn't sound like patience. Job actually seems to be feeling angry and frustrated here. And all three of his friends are ganging up on him and trying to vex him and break him into pieces with their words. Also brings me back to that saying we all said as children: "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." That could be farther from the truth. Words hurt. And Job is expressing how much these words are hurting him. So he seems to be feeling angry and frustrated. And the breakdown or the word break that he refers to here when he's saying break into pieces with their words, that word in Hebrew is dakah, which literally means to crush into powder. So this is not used here in the literal or physical sense, but in a psychological sense of the physical sense and the psychological sense. So let me repeat that because I know that's a lot. What it is saying, not literally, but it's saying a psychological sense of the physical and psychological sense of humiliation or oppression. So, this shows us that the power of our words, especially when one is dealing with hardship and tragedy, can actually cause more wounds. So, Job is saying that his so called friends, they're actually adding to his suffering. Now, he said that they have tried 10 times to accuse him. So he's not literally counting the number of times with his 10 fingers, but this in the Hebrew, this is a Hebrew idiom meaning many times and completely. So Job is saying that it is too many times to accuse a friend. Like you get once or twice, but like the number of times they kept coming to him was too much. So he's basically asking them, are you not ashamed that you abuse me? Like you're abusing me with your words, with your accusations. So they are not succeeding in making Job feel any better. But he's telling them they should be ashamed in the way that they're treating him and the way they're making him feel. So Job states that if he had done wrong, then his wrongdoing is not of their concern because he only has a responsibility to God for his actions and not man. So his own sin has nothing to do with them, and he clarifies to his friends that they cannot humiliate him because God had already done that. So the way I was reading this, what came to me is the way that they are accusing him. They're not even realizing that Job is a victim of Satan's tactics. And this is the very same way that some people accuse victims when they've been violated or attacked. Again, they don't see the facts. They just see the situation. So they automatically assume, well, you must have did something wrong for them to do this to you, or you must have done something wrong for all of this to be happening to you. So if Job has sinned, then his sin wasn't hurting them, but was hurting him. So he thinks that they should stop bothering him. And by using the word erred is actually translated from the Hebrew shagah, which means that he's implying a smaller sin. So they're looking at the weight of his suffering and trying to measure his sin according to the amount of, what should I say, the amount of grief that he's suffering. So I would say it's he's not saying that it's a huge sin that it will be expected to bring on great suffering that he's enduring. Like that's what his friends are saying. Like you must have done some great sin for something like this to happen. But Job is implying a smaller sin. So probably none in ignorance, but what he's pretty much saying is sin is not measured. It's not measured by how big or small in the eyes of God. God doesn't look at sin that way. So no matter how we try to measure sin from our own perspective, what we may think to be a small sin in our eyes may actually be big to God, especially if it's something that he told you specifically not to do. So Job's accusers act as if they are moral superiors. So they're looking down on him and his situation and thinking, "Oh, well, we've done nothing wrong and we aren't suffering to this magnitude. We aren't suffering at all." And it's almost like they're saying, "I'm living right and nothing has happened to me, so you must have done something wrong." So in Christianity, again, I just said this, but you can see here that we tend to associate wealth and good status in favor of God with living right. And we see this is further from the truth. Job was favored by God. This is actually contrary to what we think. We see the favor of God in the fact that he handpicked Job for this trial. He gave Job permission. He gave Satan permission to attack Job. because he had faith in Job's faith in him. Now, a reproach in Hebrew is kirpah. Now, this is a condition of disgrace in which Job feels treated like a terrible sinner. So, considering the things that his friends were saying to him, kind of brings me back to what our teachers and our parents used to tell us. If you don't have anything nice to say, if you don't have actual proof, don't say nothing at all. Just pray. So Job feels that God has unjustly caused him suffering, which makes Job's friends view him as a great sinner. So everything he's going through is changing his friends' perception of him, which he finds humiliating. So the word overthrown is actually in the Hebrew, it means to bend or pervert, to call someone or something. So Job thinks that God has ruined his reputation as an upright man. And he says that God has compromised or surrounded him. Or just keep in mind or imagine a person being assaulted in broad daylight, but no one listens or responds to their cries for help. Now imagine Job crying out for God's help, but seemingly God's ears are shut. So we see we see Job pleading, or Job, actually, Job is not accusing God of being unjust. Let's clear that up. Even though he's saying, like, God is the reason this is happening to me, like, God is allowing this, he's not accusing God. But what he is doing is complaining that he has not received a fair or equatable response from God, and God's not answering him. So, what happened to Job and what he's going through is not only a perfect example of that age old question, why do good things or bad things happen to good people? But it actually reminds us that God is sovereign and his blessings reign on the just as well as the unjust. So if God is allowing you to go through this, it's in his sovereignty that you're going through that. He is God is just in anything that he does. And everything that he does is for a purpose. We have to remember that. So we do not know God's plans, and we don't know enough to make accusations according to what we see in the natural, because we don't know what all God is working out in the spiritual realm. Now that brings us to our second point. Job's response to his situation. Oh that my words now Oh, that my words were now written. Oh, that they were printed on a book, in a book. That they were graven with an iron pen and lead in the rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom I shall for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not another, though my reins be consumed within me. But ye should say, why persecute we him, seeing the root of the matter is found in me? But be ye afraid of the sword, for wrath bringeth the punishments of the sword, that ye may know there is a judgment. So again, we see God, or Job's crying out to God here, and he's not getting a response. So this makes Job feel as though he's not getting fair or due diligence in his situation. So Job desires retribution, and he requests for his words to be written down so that it'll be a testimonial of his innocence on record for future generations. So Job is stating that his innocence, not only to his friends, but he's pleading for his innocence not only to his friends, but to those who will soon know his story, and ultimately to God, that he wants his words engraved with an iron pen. This way, the message could last forever and not be changed. Now, that phrase, iron pen, is also mentioned in Jeremiah 17:1. Then the sin of Judah was written with a pen of iron, and with the point of a diamond it is graven upon the table of their heart and upon the horns of your altars. So we see that this phrase in this passage of scripture signifies that the sin of the people of Judah was actually permanently and deeply engraved on their hearts. And it means that it was permanent, or it was unchangeable, or it could not, it could also refer to an instrument made of iron. Now, this is also similar to the phrase set in stone that you may hear someone say, oh, that's set in stone. So, which also means something permanent, final, or unlikely to be changed. And this idiom actually evolved from the literal act of carving something into stone, which once it was carved, it was difficult to change and it couldn't be undone. Now, Isaiah 55:11 says, so shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it. So we see when God says a word, his word doesn't return unto him void. When God speaks a thing, his words are pretty much set in stone. So in Job asking for God to write his testimony in stone, like, God, I need you to be an advocate for me, write the facts in stone that it may not be changed. So people won't be able to change the facts of the story. But when God says a thing, his words are set in stone. So Job was confident of his innocence and wanted everyone to know, even those who didn't exist yet. So Job knows and is confident that God will remove from him his circumstances, even if it's after his death. So God answers Job's desire in a way that is much better than he even imagined. The story of his suffering and godly life is recorded in the book of Job, as we read here, chapter. If you read all the way through chapter 1 to the very end, God has written every aspect of his suffering from beginning to end, and his godly life is recorded and is on record. So it is now available, his testimonial is available to everyone in the world, now more than those that were alive on the earth even in his days. So his innocence is more evident now than it was in the beginning of his suffering. And everything that God watched him endure, from the pain to every boil on his body to the holes in his heart from the words that his friends cut him with, and his closest friends' accusations of him, is all known, and is known worldwide, proving that God saw his suffering and his righteousness as well. So his references using the term redeemer in reference to God is because he's aware that only God can redeem him from death and advocate his innocence. Now remember that word redeemer. And a redeemer in Israelite society was, again, the next of kin and had certain responsibilities and privileges, such as buying back family property, and that anything that was lost as a result of debt, marrying a widow, avenging, delivering purchases, ransoming, and redeeming. So we see this as David spoke of God being a redeemer in Psalms 19 and 14. And so did Isaiah. He spoke of it in Isaiah 44:6. So he spoke in the sense as well that Job speaks of his Redeemer, that only God can vindicate him of his sins. So Job expects to die. At some point in this lesson, his conversation changes and he starts speaking as if he's going to die. And it isn't clear as to whether or not he believed that he would go to heaven when he did die. But it is clear that he saw hope. He saw hope in God declaring him innocent, and that it would be in death. If he didn't get it in this life, he would have claim to his innocence in death. And if God vindicated Job after he died, then what help would that really be? because everyone that's living is assuming that he did something wrong now. If he died, they're probably going to still think that, oh, he died. He must have really sinned. So a person's reputation is just as important in their death as it is while they're living. And a person's reputation not only affects them, it affects their family and those who are associated with them. This is why the life you live is so important, because the reputation you have while you're living is going to affect your reputation at the end. So Proverbs 22:1 says, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. The fact that Job asked for God to clear his name more than he asked for restoration of his health and riches speaks volumes. Now, a lot of people, famous people, when they die, people have so many things to say about how horrible they were. And like everything that's being said, I mean, they're dead and gone. It doesn't affect them anymore. But think of the people attached to them, their wives, their children, their siblings. They have to live with these things that are being said about their loved one long after they're gone. So reputation does matter after you die. So I found it quite interesting that Job was more concerned about his reputation in death than he was having his health or even his riches restored. So I know I'm saying so a lot. Job expresses in these verses the belief that even though worms would eat his physical body as it lay in the grave, his physical body would also be resurrected and he would be face to face with his Redeemer. This phrase expresses in these verses that even though he knew that he would experience this in the flesh, his words kind of take a turn here, and you can see that his attitude has changed from his previous statements. So Job sees beyond his present situation and looks to when he will be able to stand in the presence of God. The word reigns in the King James translation, the Hebrew word kilia refers to kidneys. And the kidneys are actually viewed as the seat of the emotions. Now, in the NIV version, the translation renders how my heart yearns within me. So, as believers get older, or even as some experience terminal diseases, the thought that excites us most is the thought that we'll see Jesus soon. So, this excites us, and Job he's looking to his experience with his Redeemer once his life ends. And he then returns his complaints concerning his so-called friends. And he says to them, how he's pretty much saying to them, or telling them that they should feel bad for the way that they're treating him. And we also see in Exodus 20:16, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. That's exactly what we see Job's friends doing here. They may not realize it in the moment, but the fact that they don't know all the details of why Job is going through what he's going through, but they're still accusing him of sin, that's bearing false witness. And Job knows in his heart that he is not guilty of the accusations of sin that his friends are making concerning him. So whether in court of law or if it's just a whisper of gossip, we need to be sure, or we actually shouldn't make accusations of someone doing anything wrong unless we've witnessed it with our own eyes, or we too will suffer the punishment from God, because we do know that gossip is a sin in the eyes of God. Now, eventually, God judges the three friends for their accusations against Job, and that they had repeatedly harassed him, who was an innocent man. So, although he had every right to, Job never accused God. He still had faith in God, and he even prayed for the very friends who accused him of sin. And because of his faithfulness and because of his prayer for his friends, God not only cleared his name, but he also gave him double for his trouble. Job 42:10 says, "And the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. And also the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before." So that is the lesson. But what I want you to take from this today, what can you learn from this lesson? Well, when we're going through something and we do not understand the reasoning behind our suffering, all we can do is go back and think of Job. It's not all that we could do, but we can always reference Job and his reaction to what he was going through. God may have selected you to endure something that is meant to not only test your faith, but also strengthen your faith as well as give God glory. We also need to be careful that if we're not on the side of suffering, but we see someone that is, we need to be very careful not to speak on things that we do not know of, because we might find ourselves making accusations instead of stating facts, or even worse, gossiping. So instead of speaking on what you don't know or trying to find a cause for someone's afflictions, whether they confess it to you or not, we are still to pray for those souls that are suffering, and God would have mercy on them and deliver them from their suffering or their affliction. James 5:6 tells us, "Confess your faults one to another and pray one for another that ye may be healed. The effectual, fervent prayer of the righteous man availeth much." So that is it. That's the lesson. I hope that I've said something to encourage you today. I hope you've learned something new. And more importantly, I hope that you will come back and join us for next week's lesson. Until we meet again, God bless.